Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with my colleague Pramila Jayapal from Seattle, Washington, and we wanted to talk about what's been happening over the last week with the executive orders on immigration and asylum that have taken place. And we want to try to take a broad perspective on this, to put it in some historical, legal, and constitutional context, and then also to talk very specifically about the executive orders and what has been taking place with them in different parts of the country, and about the multiple federal judicial rulings imposing injunctions on enforcement of those orders. But I wanted to begin actually by stepping back from the heat of the current crisis and looking instead at the idea of America. Well, what is the idea of America? America was created, as the great Tom Paine said, as a haven of refuge for people fleeing political and religious repression from all around the world. And remember the radicalism of the American Revolution and our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. We were the first nation on earth conceived in revolutionary insurgency against monarchy, dictatorship, autocracy, theocracy, and the merger of church and state. The American colonists were rebelling against not just the king and all of the whimsical depredations and abuses of the crown, but also against centuries of religious warfare in Europe between the Protestants and the Catholics. Holy Inquisition, Holy Crusades, witchcraft trials, endless wars between the Catholics and the Protestants. And our forefathers and foremothers wanted to break from that history and put into our Constitution the separation of church and state, as Jefferson called it, the wall of separation between church and state, the Establishment Clause, the idea of free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, the right to petition for redress of grievances, the right of the people to assemble, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience in the United States. But it would be a land that would be open to people who are fleeing authoritarianism, who are trying to get away from repressive regimes and kings and monarchs and princes and tyrants and dictators and despots everywhere. That was the idea behind America. Well, then in this presidential campaign, then candidate Donald Trump said that he wanted to impose a Muslim ban, a ban on Muslims coming to America, which would cause our forefathers and foremothers to turn over in their graves to hear that somebody running for president of the United States wanted to impose a ban on the immigration of people based on their religious faith. In a country that was designed on the principle of free exercise of religion, designed on the principle of no establishment of religion, designed on the principle of no religious tests for public office or political participation, that suddenly we would say we are not going to accept people in the 21st century based on their religious heritage. And of course, anybody can make up their religion anyway. Anybody can say what they are. So it's as futile and as silly as it is anathema and antithetical to our basic constitutional ideals. Well, that Muslim ban has, in its bizarre way, become law now in the United States of America. The president issued an executive order as one of his first actions on people coming to our country from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, those 7 countries. And we've got to interrogate what exactly the logic of this is. The president and his chief strategist of the alt-right, named Steve Bannon, have defended this order on the grounds of national security. The idea is that somehow we are defending the national security and the defense by banning people from those countries. All right, we all support national security. If that would advance our national security, it's something we should look at. Well, what's the evidence that that's going to benefit our national security? Our country now is no stranger to terror and to terrorism. All of us remember that shocking, fateful day 9/11, back in 2001, when America changed forever. Those 19 hijackers came from 3 countries. And which 3 countries on this list of 7 did they come from? None of them. Those hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. The overwhelming majority of them came from Saudi Arabia. Then Egypt, then the United Arab Emirates. None of those 3 countries is on this list of 7. Why not? Well, a couple of different theories are out there. One is that President Trump has business interests in those countries, is doing business with corporations in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, and in the United Arab Emirates. So that's one leading theory that's out there. The other is simply that these are rich and powerful countries. So despite the fact that they were the lead exporters from this prism of terrorist hijackers to the United States, they get a pass. And instead, we pick on Yemen and Somalia and Iraq, our presumed ally, that another Republican president sunk hundreds of billions of dollars into, waging a war based on the mythology that there were weapons of mass destruction in that country. But now they're on our side, and yet we've imposed a ban on people coming in as refugees from Iraq. But Saudi Arabia gets a pass. Egypt gets a pass. United Arab Emirates gets a pass because they're on the rich side. So what exactly do these 7 countries have in common? If it doesn't have anything to do with our national security, because you look at the other terrorist events that have taken place in our country, for example, the Boston Marathon bombers, those young men who were implicated in that crime against the people of the city of Boston and the people of the United States came from Russia originally. Is there a ban on Russia being imposed here? Quite the contrary. Earlier today, President Trump relaxed sanctions on Russia, made it easier for American businesses to export information technology to Russian companies, according to news reports. I haven't seen the exact order yet, but there's an executive order that is lessening sanctions on Russia, despite the fact that 2 of the most infamous terrorists against the United States originally came from there. So what do those 7 countries have in common? Well, they're all Muslim countries. They're poor Muslim countries. They're poor Muslim countries that Donald Trump doesn't do business with. And so maybe that's it. Maybe the idea is we're going to wage a worldwide war on the poorest, most vulnerable Muslim countries, even if they don't pose any special threat to us, because that will conform to Steve Bannon's ideological worldview of a major contest between the Christian West and radical Islamic terror. I think that would be it. But President Trump, of course, puts his business interests even above the racism and white nationalism of Steve Bannon, because the business interests have to come first in all cases. So that's the best that we can make of what has been imposed on the country. An Orwellian policy imposed with Kafkaesque incompetence all over the United States of America. So the airports are in an uproar. Families have been dislocated. Children are agonized over the situation. Panic spreading across America. And part of me wants to think, well, this is just the misfortunes of a beginning president. Maybe this is part of a design by Steve Bannon, who has proclaimed himself a Leninist who wants to tear the system down, tear the government down to start over again. Maybe that's what's going on. Who knows? But all of us brings us back to the Emoluments Clause. Now, the Emoluments Clause, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 of the Constitution, was inserted by our great founders because they feared foreign monetary dominance of the United States government. They knew that kings and princes, dictators and despots, traitors and saboteurs all over the place would try to use their money to compromise the integrity of Republican government, Republican democracy. Remember, we were trying something new here. What our great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, would later come to call government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That was the experiment that we launched then. And they knew that there was a basic problem. which is the room will not hold all. We can't have a New England town meeting every time we need to make a decision. So we've got to elect people to go be our governors. But when you elect them, now you've got an agent. And the problem all of you lawyers know out there in principal agent law is how do you make sure the agent actually serves the client rather than serves the interests of the agent himself or herself? And the founders understood that, and they were afraid that the people that we elected might go to Washington and be corrupted by foreign money, by all of the diplomats and spies running around offering gifts and gold and snuff boxes and diamonds and so on. And so what they said was that no official in our government, no official could accept any gift or emolument, any payment of any kind at all from a foreign government, a king, a prince, or a foreign government. No foreign payments. And that's something that has been observed scrupulously for more than 2 centuries by our presidents. Nobody's even come close to the line of violating that. When Benjamin Franklin, as ambassador to France, received a snuff box from the people of France, he came back and he brought it to Congress and asked Congress to approve, because it's up to this body to decide whether or not a foreign payment is acceptable or not. And Congress said, Mr. Franklin, because of your extraordinary reputation for integrity, for decency, and for honesty, we understand you've not been compromised by that snuff box, and it's just a snuff box, and you can keep it. But today, what we've got now is a president who has hundreds of millions of dollars of interests all over the world, in Russia, in the Philippines, millions of dollars of loans from the government of China, the Trump Hotel, which is renting out banquet rooms, dining halls, floors, hotel rooms to foreign governments and embassies from all over the world who've come here to try to influence our government. And what do we hear about the emoluments clause? The president come to ask us whether or not we approve of these arrangements? Nothing. Nothing has happened. Is it affecting policy? Every single day, and I come back before I turn it over to my colleague to what we're talking about, which is these executive orders, which have this very bizarre quality, my fellow Americans. They apply to poor Muslim countries where Donald Trump has no business interests. These executive orders don't apply to Saudi Arabia. They don't apply to Egypt. They don't apply to the United Arab Emirates. They don't apply to any of the countries where Trump Industries has business. That's precisely why the founders put in the emoluments clause. And I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but every American has got to learn to say it. Emoluments, all it means is payments. This is the foreign bribery clause in our Constitution. And these terrible immigration orders, which have created chaos and pandemonium across the land, are a perfect demonstration of why we need to enforce the emoluments clause and why this president needs to divest himself immediately of all these foreign concerns, or this Congress must hear the appeals that are coming from our side of the aisle and must listen to the fact that these payments that are being received on a daily basis by the president are a threat to the American constitutional order. With that, I will yield to my good friend and colleague from Seattle, Washington, Pramila Jayapal.